G'day, legends. I hope that you are doing really well. And about 3 months ago, we had an interview with Dr. Richard Connolly. And I know a lot of people loved it, but there's also a lot of criticism, like all the work that I do, that it is too long. We spoke for a few hours, but what we are going to do, and we've discussed actually offline too, we're just going to check in every couple of weeks and get an idea of something of which I'm unqualified to talk about, which is Eastern European Russian economy. So, Dr. Connolly, thank you so much for joining me again.
Hello, William. Thanks for having me back. Nice to be here.
Oh, mate, I really appreciate it. Look, of course, a lot has happened over the past 3 months since we last spoke, and we're going to break down a lot, but over a few months. And of course, what we've seen is, the ruble shift. At the time back then, everyone was saying that the ruble going down, this was, the start of the imminent collapse, that the start of the imminent collapse has now been well over 3 years. But mainly what we're going to be touching on is how is the Russian economy performing since our last talk? And of course, what effect has Ukraine's recent large drone and missile strikes against then economic institutions, from oil facilities to gas to everything? What effect has that had? But we'll start at the front. Since we last spoke to now, what sort of changes and how's the Russian economy been performing for the war?
Well, the key developments in the last 3 months since we last spoke. Let's start with the ruble. You mentioned that a moment ago. That was seen as an indicator of the malaise of the Russian economy and the fact that it had depreciated to around about 110 to 115 rubles to the dollar in November, early December, was seen as a sign that all confidence was evaporating from the Russian economy. At the time when we spoke about this, I said, let's be a bit more cautious. That in fact, it wasn't telling us that it was a more complicated explanation to do with how imports and exports had gone through, how Russian traders were responding to sanctions. And it was also a result of the ruble being a very thinly traded currency due to Western sanctions, in particular some US sanctions that were imposed at the end of last year. It meant that there aren't that many people who engage in open market ruble transactions. And that meant that as soon as you have a little flurry of activity, it can drive the ruble down or up in quite a wild way. That was the case then. And what's happened since then is the ruble now is in a very different place. In fact, there's now speculation that far from depreciating into the range of 110 and 115 rubles that we saw at the end of last year, it's now closing in on 80. This is the strongest the ruble will have been to the dollar in around about 18 months. So we've seen a real turnaround in the ruble. Now, I think what's important there is, does that tell us that things are really improving for the Russian economy? No. In the same way that I didn't think that in November that the poor performance of the ruble, the depreciation, told us anything particularly worrying about the Russian economy. I apply the same standards now and say just because it's appreciating, it doesn't mean things that have necessarily improved. There's a little bit of optimism at the moment that the peace talks with the United States might result in some sanctions relief, and that's causing some people to come in and trade ruble-denominated products. But for the most part, it's the gyrations in the ruble are to do with that sort of the balance of trade that Russian importers and exporters contribute towards. In short, Russia is proving quite capable of circumventing Western sanctions, selling its oil products, and as a result of that, that drives up the demand for rubles, and that is driving the price of the ruble higher. So I've tried to keep it simple there because it is quite a complex equation. But the long and short is it's appreciating, but it still doesn't tell us anything, that anything significant has changed in the Russian economy.
And how's the performance been for the ability then to fund these semi-private public like defense companies to continue making tanks and shells, and as well as continue paying these record prices to soldiers as well, of money that we haven't seen ever available, if you take into the purchasing power parity, in the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars for individual soldiers. How has anything changed there for Russia's ability to continue doing that?
Well, if we're thinking about Russia's ability to finance the war, then the first place to look is the federal budget. And when we last spoke at the end of November, we were a couple of weeks away from President Putin signing into law the federal budget for this year and for the 2 years ahead, so for 2025 to 2027. And that budget law, when he signed it into law on December the 6th, projected for this year that Russia would increase defense spending from round about 14 trillion rubles in 2024 to around about 17 trillion rubles this year. Now, that's the plan. Of course, plans don't always stand up to when they make contacts with reality. But over the last 3 years, the Russian budget has largely sort of corresponded with the plans, more or less. So what we expect they're planning on is increasing military spending to around about 7.2% of GDP. That's a hell of a lot compared to NATO countries, any NATO country, a hell of a lot compared to most other countries in the world. The question that you're asking is, can it afford to do this? Can it continue to spend at that rate? Well, if we look at the taxes that came in last year, it was a record year for Russian federal taxes. A lot of that came from oil and gas, mainly oil receipts, but a record amount came from non-oil receipts. So the Russian government has done a fantastic job of taxing the population outside the hydrocarbon sector, and that has enabled it to pay for all the things that you've just described there: the equipment, the munitions, the record high salaries for Russian servicemen. Now, in the first 2 months of this year, coming up to 3 now, but we've got 2 months of budget data, we can see, and some of your listeners may have noted this in the press, that Russia spent a lot in the first 2 months, that the federal budget was in a deficit. And some have jumped on this and said, look, it's another sign that Russia's spending so much it can't afford to keep up this spending. Again, I would urge caution when analysing these figures. I'm used to doing this, and it's happened every year for the last 3 years, that at the beginning of the year, the federal government front loads its expenditure. So it basically pays the defence companies, the defence manufacturers, for their year's production up front, to give them the certainty that they can produce their equipment, the munitions, the equipment, and they will be paid. And so what we saw last year, and also in 2023, was a big spike in the early months of the war in federal government expenditure, and then that gradually diminishes over the year. And therefore, the budget deficit, which appears large in January and February, tends to diminish as the year goes on. So, again, I don't want to bog your listeners down in too much detail, but it's just another, I think, example of how let's not just look at the most recent data points. Let's step back and look at the types of trends, the types of patterns that we've seen in the past. And if we do that, we can say, I think, with some confidence that the likelihood is that Russia will be able to afford this elevated record level of defense spending. So if the war carries on, if there isn't a ceasefire, there isn't a peace agreement, then financially speaking, they're well placed to keep it up. And one of the other reasons, one of the other reasons for that, and this is another key point if we're thinking about the economy over the last 3 months, is we can look at the growth figures for last year. When we spoke in November, the forecast from the Russian government was that the Russian economy will grow by 3.6% in 2024. Well, the figures came out last month, and actually it grew by 4.1%. So last year's growth performance exceeded even those relatively optimistic projections that were made at the end of last year. So the economy has done a lot better than had been expected. That was one of the key themes of our conversation in November, and it remains the case now. Looking to the year ahead, there is an expectation that it will slow down. I think I said in November that would be the case, and I maintain that. It's going to be very difficult for Russia to maintain growth of over 4% for a third year in a row, because it grew at 4.1% in 23, grew at the same rate last year. I'd be very, very surprised if it kept that up this year for some of the supply side constraint reasons that we discussed in November. But nevertheless, it looks as though the economy should continue to grow, anywhere between 1.5% and 2.5%. And if it does that, reaching those budget goals that I've just outlined, hitting those military expenditure targets, that should all be, I think, comfortably doable for the federal government.
Is there any signs in the Russian economy that don't look positive? Because we hear about they may be able to keep this up and the ruble. Is there anything that you see think, oh, that doesn't look good?
Yeah, there's a few very black clouds for the economy as a whole. So we can take some sectors and we can take some themes. If we take sectors that have been particularly badly affected by sanctions and the war, they include the coal industry, which is really on its knees. Russia sold a lot of its coal before to Europe, and when Europeans ceased to buy coal, they had to then send that coal east from the Kuzbas coal producing region in sort of central Russia, western Siberia, and they had to send it east. Doing so was very difficult logistically because a lot of this transport takes place via rail. So it completely screwed up the Russian railway system because a lot of Russian railway traffic comprises coal. They sent it east, and then they did so at a time when coal prices globally were going down, and Russia's undercut by the likes of Indonesia and other big coal producing countries elsewhere. So it's been unable to sell its coal. And that's caused a depression in the coal industry. A lot of its coal industry enterprises are loss making at the moment. They're having to be supported by the government. Now, you might think to yourself, coal, is that really an important sector? Well, in Russia, it still is. It's one of the world's most important coal producers, and whole cities and regions are dependent on that product. So that's doing very badly. Natural gas is doing very badly. Gazprom posted its financial results last year. It ran a record loss under Russian accounting rules of 1 trillion rubles. That's about $15 billion. Again, why did that happen? Because it's no longer selling the volume of gas that it used to Europe. So before the war, it was selling about 120 to 140 billion cubic meters of gas to Europe. Last year, it sold about 35 billion cubic meters by pipeline. It also sold some LNG, which liquefied natural gas, which actually reached record levels, but it's nowhere near as much pipeline gas as it used to sell. And that's caused some big problems for Gazprom. As I said, massive losses. So coal and gas aren't looking good. The construction sector is slowing. That had done very well in the first few years of the war because there were some very generous mortgage subsidies put in place by the government. Those subsidies had actually been put in place in response to coronavirus, and then they were kept as a sort of an anti-crisis policy when the war began, and that contributed to a mortgage boom, and it contributed to a construction boom. That's slowing now because those subsidized loans aren't being rolled out in the same way as they were, and interest rates are high. So, if we're looking at sectors, those sectors are slowing. If we look at themes, I mentioned one a moment ago, and that's interest rates. The key rate is at a post-Soviet record, 21%. I think I mentioned in November that although that sounds eye-wateringly high, in fact, it is more manageable in a country which has a higher level of inflation, and where there's a lot of sectors that are actually exempt from that 21% rate. But nevertheless, it is causing problems for those who do have to pay, the market rate. People aren't able to borrow as much, and loan repayments are accounting for a higher share of some people's incomes. So that's something that, as long as it continues at that high rate, we should expect to see it slow economic activity. That's why it's there. That's what the central bank wants it to do. They want to slow economic activity because in doing so, it'll bring down inflation. So the key rate being high is a challenge for some, and the longer it goes on, it will continue to be challenging. Inflation, despite that high key rate, is proving stubborn. So inflation for the end of last year was about 9.5%. Again, that's the overall headline figure. For a lot of people in Russia, it would have felt higher than that. The particular food products, it was occasionally higher. And it's not going down despite the high key rates. So the central bank's doing what it can, but it's not having a great deal of success. Now, I don't, again, as we spoke in November, I try not to push that inflation danger too far. Yes, it's high, but it's high in a lot of countries. It's a lot higher in Ukraine at the moment, and you don't hear the Western media talking about how that's going to bring Ukraine to its knees. Russians have a long history of dealing with relatively high levels of inflation, And 9.5%, 10% as a headline figure over the course of the last 30 years is unspectacular. It's actually towards the low end. But nevertheless, it will be causing some concerns, certainly in the central bank and certainly in some parts of the government. And then the other problem, again, it's where we spoke about it in November, and it's not going to go away, is this problem of a tight labor market. Russia's had a shrinking labor force since 2015 for structural demographic reasons, and this high economic growth and this intense war, which has resulted in hundreds of thousands of Russians being called up for military service, have combined to hoover up all of that excess labor. And so Russia's unemployment rate is at a record low. The last, I think the figure for January is 2.4%. That's very, very low. That's full employment. And that is another reason why inflation is proving stubborn, because when your unemployment level so low, enterprises, employers, they have to throw money at personnel to get them to work for them. So that's something that won't go away. It's not helped by the fact that the Russian government has quite an unconstructive approach towards migrant labor. Ever since the Crocus City Hall terror attack about a year ago in Moscow, the environment, the atmosphere towards migrant labor, in particular from Central Asia, from Tajikistan, from Uzbekistan, has soured. And as a result, a lot of migrant laborers haven't moved to Russia in the numbers that they did before. And whilst that continues to be the case, it's going to make it more difficult for Russia to deal with this labor shortage problem.
But again, these feel like things that are super affected in the war. What do you see then contributing after in the post-war attrition? Can Gazprom and the coal industry, can they then find other markets, even if Europe continue the sanctions? How bad will this then, like how much relief will there be once the war actually comes to a close versus what will continue as a post-war attritional aspect of the Russian economy?
Well, a lot's going to depend on what happens with the sanctions regime. If there is some sanctions relief, then that opens up some possibility for Russia to be able to sell some of its products that it's finding hard to sell at the moment. So if, for instance, if the United States were to say that they would be happy to trade in some energy products with Russia, not so much trade with it, but to not impose sanctions on countries that buy Russian energy, then I think that a lot of European countries, not all, but a lot of them would think, hang on a minute, we're the ones experiencing the biggest losses by not buying cheap Russian gas. And our companies are less competitive relative to American equivalents. So, should we not get back to buying Russian gas, at least at some volume? Now, there will be some difficulties for that happening. Which pipelines do they come through? Do they come through Ukraine? Because, of course, Ukraine ceased to allow gas through Ukraine as of the end of last year, as of the 31st of December. So, you'd need a new agreement to allow Russian gas to come through Ukraine. They could come through pipelines that go through Poland, but you'd need the Poles to be on side for that. The Poles are pretty hardline and hawkish when it comes to Russia. You could repair and reopen Nord Stream 1 and 2. Again, there'd be some problems within Germany. If there was political will, then it could happen. But at the moment, that's not there. So that's why I say a lot depends on the sort of sanctions environment. If there is an opening within Europe, which could happen in response to an opening for the United States, to allowing trade in gas again, then that could see some volumes. I don't expect that it would be anything like the pre-war level, but you might see an extra 20 or 30 BCM a year flowing to Europe. If that happened, then Gazprom's financial position would look a lot stronger. Gazprom's also trying to increase its sales of gas to Central Asia, which might sound a bit mad because Central Asia's got a lot of gas. But what they'll do is they'll supply gas to Central Asia, and Central Asia will supply more of their gas to China. So it's a sort of an indirect way of supplying gas to Western China. And they've signed some agreements with Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan last year, which will result in not massive amounts, but again, maybe 10, 15 BCM over the coming years. So Gazprom is looking at some ways to get that gas to market, and sanctions relief would offer a way to do that. The coal industry, that's a bit different. I think if the sanctions relief, that could help. They could then maybe start selling some coal back to Europe again. But also what happens on the global market is important. Prices are low at the moment for coal. If they were to be high again, maybe because of an increase in growth in the Chinese economy, which is by far the world's largest consumer of coal, that could make the price a bit more attractive for Russian producers and enable them to do better. So, those two factors will be important. A lot will depend, though, on the extent of sanctions relief offered by the US. I think, in my assessment, if the US offers sanctions relief, I think a lot of European countries, that unity that we've seen over the last 3 years, will crack. And those that will benefit most from business with Russia will rush to do that. I have it on from various sources that there is a big clamoring in Brussels amongst a lot of companies at the moment. They're seeing what's happening between the Trump administration and the Kremlin, and are seeking to have the rules changed so that they can get back to selling their products to Russia and to buying cheap Russian energy. So there's going to be a lot of people that want that to happen.
Yeah, and I guess for Europe, wanting to rearm, reindustrialize, there's this idea of, can Europe stay competitive with the powers that be around the world now that we've had a massive industrialization and military industrial companies in other areas? Can Europe actually just remain competitive if they're not having cheap energy come from somewhere? And that's something I guess we can talk about later on. What I really wanted to get into, because today it is relevant given it's the 19th of March. And of course, we've seen Trump and Putin then have a ceasefire for striking energy systems. We've seen over the past 6 weeks, Ukraine have a massive campaign, drones and recently missiles, against Russian oil facilities and other forms of energy. How much of a tangible effect has that actually had on Russia's total energy industry? Because I've done a little bit of ChatGPTing with it, and it's a bit hard to get to areas, but within 1,000 Ks of what is being hit. How much have we seen, and how much of a real effect on Russia's economy have we seen those strikes have? Because it seems like it's well accepted that Ukraine is not going to militarily break Russia, but that they are going to economically break them through these strikes. Have we seen real impact of those?
Yeah, I think the short answer to that is that the strikes have had some impact, and they've had some impact on particular refineries, as you suggest, those that are within range and those that they've been able to hit the most. But that impact has been relatively modest. And the reason for it being modest is because it really is to do with the scale of Russian oil production and the scale of, more specifically, Russia's refinery capacity. So Ukrainian strikes have been underway for about 18 months, and they've really accelerated over the last sort of 15 months. I'd say it was just over a year ago that we started to see this become a much more regular occurrence. And so therefore, we can look at some annual figures to give you a sense of just how much impact they've had. So if we look at Russian oil exports, and I'll try and keep the figures relatively straightforward. If we look at Russian crude exports, now crude is not affected by strikes on, well, it is affected, but it's not directly affected by strikes on refineries. But if we look at crude exports last year, so non-processed oil, crude fell last year by about 4%. Right, crude production. Right, that's nothing to do with these strikes. But the reason it fell a little bit was nothing to do with Ukrainian strikes. It was everything to do with the OPEC Plus agreement, where Russia had committed to reining in production to hopefully push up global prices. So crude largely unaffected, and to the extent that it went down, it was to do for reasons that were nothing to do with Ukraine. Where we would expect to see Ukrainian strikes have an impact would be on refined products, and in particular on Russia's ability to export those products, because that's where it would make the money. Because selling refined products is generally more profitable than selling crude. Russia had spent many years expanding its refinery capacity so that it could sell refined oil and make more money in doing so. Now, total exports of refined products fell last year by about 7.5%, right? Which is quite a lot. And I would say that a lot of that decline will have been due to Ukrainian strikes and the disruption that it caused to those facilities that have been struck, that have to be closed down, repaired. By the way, they don't all, when a facility is hit, it doesn't mean the entire facility is closed down and then has to be repaired. Very often it's just, you know, a particular part of it. But they have caused some damage. However, Russia's refinery capacity is enormous. It has the capacity in a year to maximum capacity to refine maybe 4 million barrels a day of oil, right? Which is a rough figure, depending on which part of the oil refinery sector we're looking at. But overall, around about 4 million. Last year, it exported to 2.45 and domestically kept some for itself as well. So to supply the domestic market, there was still excess capacity. So there's still more capacity than Russia is refining, which is to say, even if some of this, these oil facilities are hit, they have other facilities that can be brought online, or they can shift refinery runs to compensate. So when you're hitting a country with this enormous capacity for refinery, you have to hit lots of it constantly and keep it offline for long periods in order to have a really decisive impact. And Ukraine's long-range drone strikes haven't been able to achieve that. And so, you know, seeing refinery exports go down by 7.5% is significant, but it's meant that it hasn't really affected the revenues that have accrued to Russia. So if you look at Russia's federal budget revenues derived from the oil sector last year, its oil and gas revenues, it was not as high as 22, but higher than 23. And it was one of their record years. So despite the fact that the Ukrainians have caused this disruption at the margins, and for some refineries, they've caused a lot of disruption. It hasn't really disrupted the overall revenue picture for Russia, and it hasn't really disrupted the overall volume of both, as I say, crude and refined products that have been exported. And it doesn't look like that's going to change this year either. So long and short is, yes, there's disruption. And for those particular refineries, it's going to be expensive. You know, they have to undergo costly repairs. Sometimes they have to try to replace technologies that aren't available because of Western sanctions. But I would say it's an irritant for the political leadership in Moscow, but nothing more. And therefore, I think we need to look at that bigger picture. I think if we're looking at the energy war, if we're looking at the relative impacts of the Russian strikes on Ukraine's energy system, in particular its power generation system, I would say that has been more impactful than Ukrainian strikes on Russia's enormous refinery capacity.
Perfect. Yeah, and we see with those sanctions again today with the ceasefire, with the ceasefire, that now those strikes aren't going to be taking place, then those refineries can rebuild and get back online. Now, look, I have to be aware that you have a hardline meeting in what I'm seeing as a minute away. Look, mate, again, thank you so much for running us through all of this. We have a heap of topics that we're going to cover in the next coming weeks and see how the war unfolds. So, look, thank you again, mate, so much for coming on.
Nice talking to you, Willie, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Easy, mate. Okay, I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.